We can bring in France 24's Annette Young, host of the 51%. Annette, good morning. We had the Prime Minister announcing these measures on what is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. What measures is the French government proposing here?
They're coming up with 50 or so proposals, and they include an enormous range of things, anything from seizing firearms from people already suspected of domestic violence. They're going to prioritise police training, because one of the major flaws in France, and the reason why this country does have such a high figure compared to other Western European nations, has been, rather the blame's been pointed towards the police and the lack of proper response. So they want to put training of police officers up very high. They want to formally recognise psychological violence as a form of domestic violence, because when you talk about domestic violence, it isn't just physical abuse, but emotional abuse as well. It's basically forms of controlling behaviour. They're talking about recognising forced suicides as a form of femicide. They're talking about establishing regional centres which will be used to rehabilitate men who've been convicted of lesser crimes associated, obviously not serious enough to be in jail, but enough for them to be effectively put through these programs to change their attitudes towards women. They're talking about an overhaul of the judicial system to streamline it so that a lot of these cases are expedited, because they linger in the system way too long. And when you think about it, when you have a partner or an ex-partner, basically a family member accused of violence against his partner or his children, and they're still in contact during that time, it makes it very, very difficult. They're also talking about family court judges, for instance, being allowed to suspend the visitation rights of the accused individual. So that will be important. Opening up the complaint system so that medical care workers, particularly people in hospitals, doctors and nurses, who are now realised or recognised as frontline responders, because they're going to see these people come in, that they themselves can complain or issue a complaint on their behalf, and also calling for women hospitalised for domestic violence to now be allowed to file a criminal complaint from their hospital bed.
And Annette, just talking about the numbers, 116 women this year alone have been killed by either their partner or ex-partner in France. Why are these numbers so high?
It is incredible, and I'm going to ask the producer just to full screen that graphic, which we just had a bit earlier, which is basically a woman is murdered every 3 days in France by either her partner or ex-partner. This is one of the world's wealthiest nations. Yeah. It is indeed a shocking figure. Why does it happen in a nation that prides itself on gender equality and has, we have a government who very much prioritises it? Well, I think a lot of possible factors are mentioned. One, again, is the lack of police response, the lack of understanding among sort of police personnel about the need to deal and treat these cases importantly. It's also, some would argue, a bit about the Latin culture possibly being another element. French feminists say it's the figures are effectively the tip of the iceberg in a very deeply sexist society. And again, it's very surprising, I think, for people outside of France to realise this, that despite the fact that, prides itself and one of its values is liberté, égalité and fraternity, sexism is a massive problem in this nation. And they will tell you, if you go back to the laws that are based on the Napoleonic Code, which effectively, historically, affirmed the legal right of men to control women. For instance, it was only in 1965 that a married French woman could ask for permission to work. It was only in 1994, Delano, that the law was changed to prevent men from being given lighter sentences for killing their wives, which is what in those days was called crimes of passion. So you can get a sense of culturally the mindset that still exists, still prevails in legislation. Part of the problem, of course, is bringing legislation up to date. It's not something that can be done overnight. It needs to have a government majority, a government will to do it, and then the majority to push it through Parliament. It takes time, but it's also changing cultural mindsets. And one of the things that's going to come out of these new measures, which is very important and comes back to what I was just talking about, cultural biases, is teaching equality to boys, making them understand that it's not a case of men can act without impunity when it comes to acts of violence towards women, that it's not appropriate and not at all acceptable.
Indeed.